Okay, so we are at passage 4 of chapter 4. Take a look at that, read it over, and decide if it contains an argument or not. Is this passage attempting to convince us that something is true? Pause for a moment and think. So, what do you think? I think that this is an argument. Read it over again and decide what the conclusion is. What is the claim that this passage is trying to convince us of? Pause for a moment and think. Okay, so what do you have? What do you think the ultimate conclusion is? I think that it's genuinely hard to see in this passage. So I want to try something new and different. Let's pretend that we don't know what the conclusion is, because sometimes we won't. This is especially the case if you're reading something that's really long, because the conclusion might not show up until near the end of the passage. And you don't have all day. You might want to start mapping the thing right away. So let's do that. Let's start at the top and just kind of number the claims as they come. Now, I am going to put a little asterisk next to 1 under those circumstances, because normally I want to use 1 for the ultimate conclusion, but sometimes we can't, so we won't. Let's take a look. Again, read, identify the important claims, figure out how they are related to each other, represent that relationship, read on. If you see an inference indicator expression, represent that right away, and then ask yourself, how is that thing, whether it's one claim or a little argument module, related to what has gone before? Is it related with an arrow, an inference with a plus, like dependent reasons, or separate? Do your best. Why don't you just try to map this? Give yourself time. I'm not going anywhere. Pause the video and start it once you have a stab at a map, even if that is tomorrow. Okay, so give it a shot. Okay, so let's work through this together. Let's start at the top. It is a fact of human nature that the desire to attain pleasure and avoid pain is the ultimate motivation for everything we do, because, okay, I see the because here. That leads me to think that probably the argument has started right away. Obviously, if we don't know what the conclusion is, it's hard to decide whether a claim is important by asking ourselves, does this claim help us to support the conclusion? Because we don't know what the conclusion is. So let's just represent that because. It is a fact of human nature that the desire to attain pleasure and avoid pain is the ultimate motivation of everything we do. I'm going to call that 1. And again, I'm going to asterisk that just to remind myself, I don't mean to imply here that this is going to be the ultimate conclusion. It might not be. It's just the first claim in the passage. Because whenever we try to act in a way that shows we aren't doing that, it turns out we are doing that. There we are. That will be 2. So represent the relationship between 1 asterisk and 2. Pause the video, do that. Okay, so what do you have? Because, remember, is a reason indicator expression. It says what follows me is a reason to believe something else. So that means that 2 is a reason to believe 1, and I'm just going to move this up here so I have a little bit more room. So we're going to have 2 as a reason to believe 1 asterisk, like that. Okay, good. This is 1. We start over. Not the best. I won't try to draw the asterisks. Just trust me. Just see it in your mind's eye. There we go. 1 because 2. Now we continue to read. Obviously, any sound system of ethics must be grounded in a solid understanding of human nature. So, is that going to be important? I think so. How would you put that into the argument? I'll give you a moment, pause the video, think about it. Okay, what do you think? Obviously, any sound system of ethics must be grounded in a solid understanding of human nature. How is that going to go in there? Well, I think it's going to be connected to this, not separately. It's bound up with it. So it's either going to be an inference or a plus. I think it's going to be a plus. I think they're going to be dependent reasons. So now we just have to ask, does 3 play more nicely with 2, meaning it should be added to 2? Or does 3 play more nicely with 1, meaning it should be added to 1? So think about that for a moment and pause the video. Okay, what do you think? 2 says, whenever we try to act in a way that shows we aren't trying to avoid pleasure, to attain pleasure or avoid pain, it turns out that we are trying to do that. And then 3 says, any sound system of ethics must be grounded in a solid understanding of human nature. I'm not seeing a lot of commonality between 2 and 3, which would allow me to connect them as dependent reasons. Let's take a look at 1 asterisk. It is a fact of human nature, magic words, that the desire to attain pleasure and avoid pain is the ultimate motivation of everything we do. Obviously, any sound system of ethics must be grounded in a solid understanding of human nature. Well, those go together, right? Because they're both talking about human nature. So let's add 3 to this. Very good. Now let's continue to read. It follows that actions are morally good if they tend to produce pleasure and morally bad if they tend to produce pain. Okay, I think that's going to be important. Why? Well, for one, partly because of the it follows that, right? I mean, it follows that. Well, I'll ask you, is it follows that more like because, meaning it's a reason indicator, or is it more like therefore, meaning it's a conclusion indicator? Think about that and pause for a bit. Okay, what do you think? It follows that is more like therefore. It follows that as something that people often confuse, but it follows that, right? It follows from this, that. So this is, I'm just having it be yellow because it is a reason. It's an inference indicator expression of the conclusion indicator variety. And so now I know that for follows from this. But I think before I even draw that, let's just read ahead a bit. Furthermore, do you see that furthermore? Furthermore has sometimes the effect of saying, here comes another line of reasoning. Furthermore, right? So I'm going to write the 4 a little bit over here on an angle. Now, if you don't, angle schmangle, right? It doesn't matter if you don't write it on an angle, but I am going to, just to have it be as pretty as I conceivably can have it be. There we go. And now that line of reasoning is completed because furthermore is often a line of reasoning shifter. So an action that produces pleasure or pain in one culture will tend to do so in another. And so a system of ethics that ties the morality of an action to the production of pleasure or pain will allow us to avoid cultural relativism, which, as we've seen, is a very good thing to avoid. That's a lot in that passage. So think about how you would chop that sentence up into parts and how you would represent the relationship between those parts in a map. And I will give you a moment to think, so pause the video. Okay, so what do you have? An action that produces pleasure or pain in one culture will tend to do so in another. It's going to be an important claim. It's going to be 5. And so, okay, and so. Is and so more like and, meaning it's probably going to be dependent reasons, or is it more like so, meaning it's going to be an arrow? So trumps, right? And so is more like so. which tells me that a system of ethics that ties the morality of an action to the production or pleasure or pain will allow us to avoid cultural relativism, follows from 5. I'm splitting here at the which as we've seen, because basically that's another claim that says cultural relativism is a very good thing to avoid. In order to make that, well, we'll come back to that. Let's represent 5 and 6. 5 and so 6 is going to be like this. 5 and so 6 down there. Good. Now let's go back to this which, as we've seen, is a very good thing to avoid. The which here, that refers to something else, right? So if we wanted to, we don't have to, but it's always good to know what a referring word refers to. Ask yourself, what is that which referring to? Give you a moment to think, so pause the video. Okay, what do you think? A system of ethics that ties the morality of an action to the production or pleasure or pain will allow us to avoid cultural relativism, which refers to cultural relativism. So I am just going to write CR so I remember what I'm talking about. And basically then what this is saying is cultural relativism, as we've seen, is a very good thing to avoid. So that will be 7. So now ask yourself, how is 7 related to 5 and 6? With an inference, with a plus, or separate again? And again, remember, unless this author is kind of borderline incompetent, 7 is not going to be related to this line of reasoning. Don't jump back and forth between lines of reasoning. So just take a look at, the 5 and 6. How is it related to that? Pause the video and think. Okay, what do you think? Cultural relativism is a very good thing to avoid. A system of ethics that ties the morality of an action to the production of pleasure or pain will allow us to avoid that. It seems to me like those are very, very tightly coupled. So I would say that 7 is related to 6, like this, added together, right? Let's double check that. A system of ethics that ties the morality of an action to the production of pleasure or pain will allow us to avoid cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is a very good thing to avoid. What would follow from 6 and 7 put together? Let's do that puzzle piece test and see. So what do 6 and 7 have in common? It's the first thing we want to ask. And I will use blue to kind of mark what they have in common. Well, they're both talking about cultural relativism. And they're both talking about avoiding it, being allowed to avoid, right? Which, I mean, actually, I suppose I should say, why didn't any of you interrupt me? This which doesn't refer to cultural relativism technically. It refers to avoiding cultural relativism, right? Well, no, I guess which cultural relativism is a very good thing to avoid. So we're fine. So avoid cultural relativism to avoid, right? Excellent. So that's what they have in common. So if we think about that as the place where the two puzzle pieces join, the resulting idea will be composed of the ideas that are unique. So what do we have? A system of ethics that ties the morality of an action to the production of pleasure or pain is a very good thing. What's that like? An action is morally good if they tend to produce pleasure or pain, and produce pleasure, and morally bad if they tend to produce pain. In other words, it's a very good thing to accept an ethical theory as it is described in claim 4. So if you saw that, pat yourself on the back. There we have it. Good deal. So what is the ultimate conclusion here? Behold, It's this. There we have it. That's the ultimate conclusion right there. Whoops, I don't mean to do that. Sorry, I meant to do this. Oh, I'm sorry. I know this is ugly. Look away. Look away. There we go. And actions are morally good if they tend to produce pleasure, and morally bad if they tend to produce pain. That is the ultimate conclusion. Weird, huh? Look where it is in the passage. It's right in the middle. We have not seen that before. In all arguments that we've seen up until now, the ultimate conclusion will sort of be positioned at the very beginning of the argument. There might be some rhetorical sentences at the beginning that we ignore, but once we hit the argument, it might be first, or it might be near the end. This is the first time we've seen it kind of sandwiched there in the middle. Can you see why that's okay under circumstances like this? It's because it's in the middle of these lines of reasoning. And sometimes that can help you to see when you have multiple lines of reasoning. If we were able to, going in, see that 4 was the ultimate conclusion, and if we knew that there was part of the argument before 4 and a part of the argument after 4, that leads us to think that certainly 4 cleaves between 2 lines of reasoning. So there's going to be at least 2 lines of reasoning. 4 is going to be at the end of one line and at the beginning of another. So that's a little tip right there. So let's think about this argument a bit. Oh, by the way, this beginning part, that's from Jeremy Bentham. Bentham's a utilitarian. We talked about Bentham a little bit earlier in the semester, but that's really not what we need to focus on right now. What do you think about this argument? Is it good or is it bad? Think about it, pause for a moment, and then come back. Okay, so what do you decide? 2 is weird, right? Whenever we try to act in a way that shows we are not trying to avoid pleasure or avoid pain, it turns out that we are trying to do that. Why would anybody think that? Is that true, right? The first question of any premise, is that true? Can you see why Bentham and others might think it's true? The idea is, if I decide, you know, I just don't want to think of myself as being quite that hedonistic. It's not exactly the best use of the word hedonistic, but I don't want to consider myself to be so kind of motivated by my own pleasure or the desire to avoid my own pain. I want to think that I transcend all of that. So I want to show that that doesn't describe me. So I'm going to act in a way that runs counter to it. I might take this pen, for instance, and jam it repeatedly into my hand until I bleed, and then I can say to you, look, you see, if I were really motivated by attaining pleasure and avoiding pain, I would not have done that, right? Whereupon you could say to me what? You could say to me, haha, so I guess you're right. And I could say, that's right, I'm right. And then you could say, makes you happy, doesn't it? And then I'd have to go, do, right? That's basically what Bentham is saying. Pretty clever. So it's a fact of human nature then, that we are kind of like pleasure-seeking machines and pain avoidance machines, says Bentham. So that's the inference from 2 to 1. Any sound system of ethics must be grounded in a solid understanding of human nature, because presumably ethics are supposed to apply to humans. So it should be grounded in what humans are like. And if we are like this, that should lead us to think that an action is good if it tends to maximize pleasure, and bad if it tends to do the otherwise, and it's also good if it tends to minimize pain, tying the ethical value of an action to pleasure and pain. This, by the way, is utilitarianism. For those of you following along with the philosophical content here, I'm not going to assess you on this, but it's good to know. Utilitarianism. It says that an action is good if it tends to produce the greatest good for the greatest number, not just you, for the greatest number, and bad if it tends otherwise, right? Now, I don't think this argument is laughably awful over here on the left. If I were to challenge it, I might challenge it in 3. I might say, well, yeah, we have to understand what humans are like when we come up with our ethical system, but we don't need to be guided entirely by what humans are like, because maybe what ethics are supposed to do is control the way we behave and have us do something else, right? So I think 3 is open to a challenge there. I will let you evaluate the line of reasoning over here on the right. There's nothing here that really kind of leaps out at me as something that we need to discuss. So here we have this line of reasoning. I add that line of reasoning. Before we leave this, though, I do want to pose some general questions about evaluating arguments like this. Let's suppose that we decided that we wanted to reject 3 for the reason that I said, that, yeah, we might want to be guided by what humans are like, but it looks like Bentham here by guided by means sort of slavishly adhere to in such a way that if something is natural for us, it's good. That's maybe questionable. So let's suppose that we reject 3. Is that enough to have us reject this line of reasoning? I'm just talking about the left-hand line of reasoning. Think about that. Pause. Okay, so what do you think? It is, right? If 3 is bad, 1 cannot get us 4 all by itself. That's why we have to add to 1 and 3. So if 3 is bad, that line of reasoning fails. If this line of reasoning fails, what does that tell us about the argument as a whole, right? Can I say that this entire argument's bad? I'll give you a moment. Think about that. Pause. Okay, so what did you decide? If this line of reasoning is bad over here on the left, is the entire argument bad? Always, for sure? No, because this ultimate conclusion is supported by another line of reasoning. If this right-hand line of reasoning is good, and I shall leave that up to you to decide. In fact, I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you want to accept 3 too. If even one line of reasoning is good, the argument's good. That's the beauty of sort of distributing the weight of the argument among different lines of reasoning. Very good. So that is number 4. In the next section, we are going to be taking a look at some specific inference forms. So that's going to be a little bit different. So if you've been kind of running through these, this might be a good time to just take a bit of a break. And I will see you in passage 5.